North Idaho looks quiet from above. Just trees, hills, and space. But on one ridge near Naples, that silence was about to break. Very soon. Operations like this begin in small movements, quiet steps, measured distance, a plan held in someone's head, and then one moment turns the plan into noise. So suddenly, on August 21st, 1992, an attempt to arrest Randy Weaver spiraled into a firefight. In a forest like this, confusion spreads faster than facts. That morning, when multiple agencies converge, the scene fills with voices, orders, assumptions, fragments of truth. The pressure isn't only tactical, it's political, and it starts immediately, right away. After the first exchange, the ridge stops being a place and becomes a perimeter. Every minute adds people, pressure, and consequences, almost instantly. Crisis management starts with a table, a map, and too many opinions. Everyone wants control, because control is what you'll be judged on later, in hindsight. In a fast-moving crisis, the public story forms before the internal story, and once the narrative hardens, every decision becomes evidence, in court. When rules are written during the operation, they feel like solutions. But later, those same pages can become the most dangerous part of the entire event. For years, when the first plan fails, specialists get called in. And once they arrive, the operation stops being local, it becomes a national headline waiting to happen, very quickly. From here, every movement looks like intent, but distance turns details into guesses, and guesses can shape decisions that can't be taken back, for good. Before anyone speaks, someone decides the tone. Threats, patience, promises, each one becomes part of the record, and the record becomes the battlefield later, years afterward. In real crises, someone is always documenting, because years later, investigators won't ask what you felt, they'll ask what you wrote, in writing. In multi-agency crises, authority becomes a maze. Everyone wants clarity, but the real question is, who owns the decision when it goes wrong, at all? Isolation changes everything. The ridge feels far from the world until the world starts calling, asking for updates you don't have, right then. External pressure doesn't wait for confirmation. Politicians, media, supervisors, each one demands certainty, even when certainty doesn't exist, every time. Policy sounds clean on paper, but on a ridge at night, with lives at stake, guidelines turn into split-second choices, and those choices echo for years, for decades. Night doesn't calm a crisis, it amplifies it. In the dark, you don't just watch the ridge, you watch your own assumptions, very easily. In a standoff, language becomes a tool. One sentence can de-escalate or lock everyone into a corner they can't exit, real fast. When information conflicts, teams start operating in different realities. And in crisis management, competing realities are how mistakes get built over time. The moment you sign, the crisis changes shape. The danger isn't only what happens outside, it's how your name will read in a report years later, in print. Mid-crisis, rules get revised to fit the moment. But when policy is written under pressure, the aftershock often hits in the paperwork, everywhere later. From far away, a threat can look like a shadow. And once you define the rules of force, you're also defining how fear gets translated into action, in practice. In places like Naples, news doesn't arrive in a flood, it arrives in pieces. But once the story escapes the ridge, it can't be contained, so fast. By day 2, the biggest threat can be fatigue. Tired people make sharp choices and then try to explain them in neat sentences at dawn. In a siege, time stretches. Hours pass, with nothing happening until everything happens at once, without mercy. In crises, one phone call can redraw the entire operation. The higher it goes, the more the stakes shift, from safety to optics, almost overnight. The moment a briefing becomes, for the record, everyone changes. Words get cleaner, details get smaller. Accountability starts taking shape, bit by bit. On the ground, it's tactical. In the courtroom, it's legal. Ruby Ridge showed how those two worlds collide and how the collision can last for decades, for generations. In a crisis, leaders map risks like weather, not because it's perfect, because it forces you to name what could go wrong in advance. Most of a siege is maintenance quiet adjustments that keep people functioning. And every small action becomes part of the chain, all night. There's always a moment when an order is almost spoken. That pause is where responsibility lives right before it becomes irreversible, forever after. Later, people won't argue only about what happened. They'll argue about what the rules allowed and who made those rules in the first place, again later. Out here, the world arrives as signals, static, fragments, half sentences, and decisions get made on what people think they heard, broken signals. As days pass, the perimeter tightens not just physically, but psychologically. The longer it lasts, the harder it is to step back, day by day. Media has gravity. Once it arrives, every pause looks suspicious, every action looks intentional, and every mistake becomes permanent, very fast. In every crisis, doubt lives inside the team. Not about effort, about whether the system is steering them toward the wrong outcome, quietly growing. Control in a standoff can feel like a thin thread. One plan, one map, one call at a time, and the thread can snap without warning, anytime, anywhere. In multi-agency crises, everyone carries a version of the story. The danger is believing your version is the only one that matters, everywhere else. Bullets end quickly, paper lasts, and later, the question won't be what happened, it'll be who authorized it, for years. The longer the siege goes, the more what-ifs appear, and every what-if becomes a future argument, waiting for a signature, right there. In a crisis, communication becomes a corridor, narrow, crowded, and loud. If the message slips, the whole operation slips with it, every minute. One briefing can shift the tone from caution to certainty, and certainty when it's built on partial facts can be the most expensive feeling in the room, in hindsight. At Ruby Ridge, law wasn't abstract. It sat right on the table, next to the map, because every tactical move carried a legal shadow all along. Even during the siege, there's an unseen audience. Supervisors, reporters, future investigators. You're not just acting, you're creating a record, even now. Under pressure, choices don't feel like choices. They feel like the only option left, and that's when errors start to look inevitable, so often. Rules of force are supposed to draw a boundary, but in real time, that boundary can blur, especially when fear starts making the edits, under stress. In a siege, assumptions are cheap and they're everywhere. But when assumptions guide policy, the price shows up later, in investigations, in hearings. Ruby Ridge is remembered for gunfire, but institutions remember paper, because documents don't fade, they wait, for decades. After the chaos, the timeline begins. Every minute gets pinned down because later, the fight won't be over the ridge, it'll be over the sequence, later, carefully. In after-action reports, verbs matter. Observed versus identified, believed versus confirmed. That's where accountability hides, so precisely. A year later, the question becomes simple and brutal. Who approved what? Not in theory on paper, with a date and a name, with dates. Ruby Ridge proved a strange truth. The most dangerous moment isn't always the gunfire. Sometimes, it's the paperwork, when the questions finally arrive, in silence. After Ruby Ridge, the story moved from the forest to offices like this, where a task force would reconstruct every decision, frame by frame, slowly, methodically. The review didn't treat it as one incident. It treated it as a period day after day because systems don't fail in a second. They fail in sequences, again, repeatedly. Some facts get preserved, some get hidden. And in public controversies, redactions don't just remove information, they create suspicion every time. What drew years of scrutiny wasn't only what people did, it was the rules they used, how they were written, applied, and justified after the fact, in detail. Writing rules during an operation is like repairing an aircraft in the air. You can do it, but every shortcut becomes a future liability, later, legally. Accountability is rarely one person. It's layers: recommendations, approvals, interpretations, and investigations peel those layers back. Layered accountability. Years later, investigators don't chase rumors. They chase signatures, because signatures turn "we thought" into "we authorized" on paper. The siege ends. Then the second crisis begins. Hearings, reports, careers on the line. Because the operation is over, but the story isn't, very publicly. People remember emotion, institutions remember files, and in a case like Ruby Ridge, the archive becomes its own battlefield in files. A big report doesn't just list facts. It builds a story, cause, effect, responsibility, until the narrative becomes official, for everyone. In high-pressure operations, every word you write is a doorway. Later, someone will walk through it and ask what you meant later on. The lesson isn't only about force. It's about governance under stress, when decisions are made fast and judged slow for years. Real crisis management isn't cinematic. It's repetitive, exhausting, and full of imperfect information, until one imperfect choice becomes the headline, too often. Policy is a mirror. It reflects what an institution believes, until stress reveals what it actually does in action. The hidden risk isn't just the moment of force. It's the moment it's justified when language tries to make chaos look controlled afterward, too. Investigations don't just assign blame. They reveal how systems think, what they reward, what they ignore, and what they panic over under pressure. After events like Ruby Ridge, institutions swing toward caution. Not always because they learned, sometimes because they're afraid of the next report, next time. Months later, you get the call. We need you to clarify something. And suddenly the crisis returns inside your own memory, all over. A real event is messy, but the official record has to fit into sentences, and the sentence you choose can define the entire story forever after. A signature is a small mark, but it echoes, because it turns a moment into a policy, and a policy into accountability, for years. Investigations love one word, authorized, because if it was authorized, someone owns it no matter how chaotic it felt at the time, in writing. Years later, the ridge looks ordinary. But history doesn't need monuments. Sometimes it lives in a place that simply stays silent. Still today. In high-stress operations, trust breaks faster than plans. And once trust fractures, every action gets interpreted in the worst possible way, so quickly. The real warning from Ruby Ridge isn't just about force. It's about process, because process is what investigators can actually prove, with proof. Every crisis teaches lessons. The question is which lessons get learned and which ones get mislearned because they're more comfortable, too easily. The shooting was a storm. The bureaucracy afterward was a hurricane, months of memos, reviews, and questions that never stop multiplying endlessly afterward. Clarity often arrives too late, after the facts, after the damage, after the signatures, and then it arrives with a subpoena during depositions. In the end, what remains is quiet, not peace quiet, the kind that holds unanswered questions inside it, inwardly, quietly. Some cases never truly close. They get filed, reopened, debated, and carried forward because their rules change the future, again, later. One paragraph can outlive an entire operation because a paragraph can become precedent, and precedent can become pressure for decades. Behind every policy debate is a human layer: families, fear, and irreversible loss. Reports measure decisions, but people live with them, deeply, forever. Ruby Ridge warns us about a simple trap: writing the rules while the crisis is still burning, then being judged by those rules forever, for life. In the end, the ridge becomes paper, stored in rooms like this, dust in the light, boxes on shelves, and questions that never fully disappear, never ends. A stamp is a small sound, but it can feel like a verdict, turning uncertainty into something permanent and official. Right there. After the crisis, the question returns in a new form. Who signed, who knew, and who decided the rules while everything was still unfolding, all over? Ruby Ridge wasn't just an operation. It became a lesson in crisis leadership, where the loudest danger ends and the quiet paperwork begins. From then, the strangest risk in a crisis isn't always outside. Sometimes it's inside a folder waiting for the day someone asks why it was written that way. One day. Ruby Ridge leaves a final lesson. Act fast, think slow, and write everything as if it will be read in a hearing, because one day it will, without fail.